Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering part 2 of my complete guide to multi-class characters in Baldur's Gate 3, where we go over every single possible multi-class combination of two characters in Baldur's Gate, the strengths and weaknesses of that combination, how you'd typically build it, how you would fit it into a party, why you'd want to fit it into a party, and everything related to that combination. We'll talk about typical level splits and in detail what sort of characters these multi-class combos lead to, so you have a great understanding of those characters, and then we'll place them in tier lists depending on how strong they are. This is the third installment of this guide, where in part 1 I went over the 12 classes as monoclass characters and placed them in a tier list to give you an idea of how each of them stacks up against one another. And then in part 2, I went over every single subclass as monoclass characters, so you have a good understanding of where we're coming from when we're looking at multi-class combinations of these characters. In the fourth part, we'll go over the subclasses for multi-classing, so by the time we're done, there should be a complete guide to every single possible character in Baldur's Gate. There are 66 possible two-class combinations in Baldur's Gate 3, and as a reminder, in part 1 of this video, I went over every combination for Barbarian and Bard, so if you're interested in those two classes, definitely check those videos out. As we go through each class, we will have already covered the previous class's combinations with that class, so there will be fewer and fewer as we go through, and each video will cover more and more classes at a time, so don't worry, this won't be a 20-part series, but it will definitely include a lot of information. As a quick reminder before I begin, I'm looking at these characters for 3 different factors. One is the raw power of that class combination. So in its optimal form, how good is this character combination for winning honor mode? 2 is the versatility of this character combination. How many different ways can you build this character? How easy is it to fit into a party? Does it require specific items in order to function? So in other words, how easy is it to get into that optimal form in order to generate the most power from this class combination possible? And 3 is ease of play, or basically how forgiving is the character to play. Over the course of an honor mode playthrough, you're going to be making hundreds of hours of inputs. Play mistakes are inevitable, and so how forgiving a character is to play is definitely something that you should look at when you're considering a character class for honor mode. I think people often only look at the peak power of a character and not how easy is it to fit into a party and how forgiving is it to play, and I think those are important considerations. But, you know, everyone loves DPS numbers, but that's not the only metric by which you should judge character classes, and so we're not going to do that. Finally, a quick reminder about the tiers. So in the top column here, I will be doing the paired class. So we'll be looking at each of the classes in turn, and then placing the 11 possible combinations with that class in the tiers below it. So for example, if I have Barbarian in the paired class combo and place Bard somewhere, then that's where I think the Barbarian and Bard class combination belongs in terms of the strength of that character. In S tier, I have character combinations that are going to be just mainstay builds. Usually, those builds will have a guide on this channel, because I've done an awful lot of guides to the best characters in Baldur's Gate 3. And these are going to be mainstays for honor mode, incredibly synergistic classes, both powerful and versatile, and they will easily help you get through honor mode if you build this class even slightly reasonably, because the classes work together so well. In A tier, I have classes that are either extremely powerful or extremely versatile, but slightly less of one or the other than the S tier class combinations. In B tier, I have classes that are still very good, and these will be totally reasonable, playable class combinations, but maybe don't reach quite the heights of power or versatility that the A or S tier character builds do. In C tier, I have builds that are niche, so there are definitely advantages to this class combination, and they give you some things that you can't otherwise get. But maybe it's not necessarily better than just taking a feat and continuing in the monoclass character, or maybe it's only for one very, very specific build. Often these builds are builds I will have covered on my channel, and I'll try to mention those where appropriate, so you can go check out more detailed build guides as you go through. And then in D tier, I have class combinations that are just weak and don't synergize with one another, so trying to combine these two classes will usually, not always, but usually result in a final class that is weaker than just a mono class of either of the base classes. Finally, I'm recording this before posting part 1, so if I decide to make any changes based on feedback that I get from the comments to where I've placed class combos for Barbarian or Bard, we'll cover those next video. I'm always open to suggestions and feedback. If there's something that you think I've missed, definitely let me know. I have often made changes to these tier lists based on community feedback because I think that's very important, and it's very useful to be able to make changes. Alright, without any further ado, let's jump in and start talking about the next couple characters, and we'll begin with Cleric. Cleric has the distinction of being the best one-level dip in the entire game. Almost every build can be improved by a single level of Cleric. Something like, I don't know, 60-70% of builds in the game will do as well or better by taking a level of Cleric. The reason for this is that the amount of stuff you get from Cleric, who gets their subclass at level 1, so you get both the base abilities and the subclass abilities from taking a single level of Cleric, is ridiculous for only a single level. You get 3 extremely important cantrips. Guidance, Thaumaturgy, and Blade Ward are all very useful for various builds. Guidance is of course a must-have for every party. You get access to Bless, Healing Word, 2 extremely powerful utility spells that add a ton of extra utility to your character. Sanctuary, which is one of the best bonus actions in the game, requiring no concentration and giving you a whole ton of extra safety, as well as medium or heavy armor proficiency and shield proficiency, and depending on what subclass you select, martial weapon proficiency. This means that just about any caster can benefit from a single level of Cleric, because you end up with much better armor and shield proficiencies, a lot more defensive utility. You also can benefit from this on a lot of martial builds who want the better proficiencies. In addition to that, if you take Light Cleric, you get the best one of the best defensive reactions in the game, almost as good as the shield spell, but requiring no resources to use, just constantly spammable disadvantage on enemy attacks against you, which is incredibly powerful. Altogether, the amount of stuff you get from a single level of Cleric massively boosts the power level of any character. Now, of course, you're paying a feat, usually, to get this, but often the things that you get are so powerful and so worth it that it is definitely worth picking up. You also get access to a bunch of saving throw related Cleric spells, of course, including Command, so if you are building a character that has high wisdom, then you can benefit from that as well. I already went over Cleric and Barbarian and Cleric and Bard, and I placed those in B tier and S tier, respectively. So if you want more detailed breakdowns of those two character classes, definitely go check that out. But it's important to how we evaluate Cleric, that the amount of stuff you get from a single level of Cleric multiclasses, the amount of stuff you get from a single level of Cleric is ridiculous. On the other hand, Clerics who are built as a main Cleric don't necessarily want a lot of levels of other classes, because your spells as you continue to level up are very good. If you sacrifice too many caster levels from your Cleric, you do lose out on some of the excellent high-level spells that Clerics have access to. Cleric and Druid. So this seems like a natural combo at first glance, and in fact, it is a natural combo. Both of these wisdom spellcasters combine very well with one another. Combining 2 wisdom characters, of course, doesn't change your save DCs for items or scrolls or anything, so this can continue to be your scroll caster, your illicit power user, your item caster, without losing any save DCs on those items. Since you're mixing and matching 2 wisdom characters, it'll still be set to wisdom using Baldur's Gate 3's weird handling of save DCs from scrolls. And all the things that you expect to get from this character combination work extremely well with one another. A druid can benefit pretty heavily from heavy armor if they're not intending to play in wild shape, and of course benefits extremely heavily from a lot of the things that Cleric gets access to, including Sanctuary, which is a broken combination with Moonbeam, giving you free damage while completely invincible, or more or less completely invincible, because at the current state of the game, Sanctuary doesn't break when an enemy takes damage from Moonbeam. Sanctuary is supposed to break when you do damage, but it's currently bugged, and the Moonbeam damage doesn't count as coming from the caster, so it will not break Sanctuary, allowing you to do a bunch of damage with perfect impunity while immune. Even outside of that broken combination, though, there's a lot of cool stuff that this class combination can do. Spirit Guardians is a great thing to concentrate on in wild shape. Being a radiating bear is pretty good. Just running around the field. Also, you get access to a bunch of extra utility from a couple levels in Cleric. on your druid. Even something like just maximizing your call lightning damage that you get from druid can be pretty valuable just by having a couple levels of Tempest Cleric. Warding Flare is an excellent defensive ability, and druids that are intending to stay in humanoid form often won't have a great reaction. Spore druids do have their reaction, their proactive reaction to do damage, but that's a very small amount of damage, and Warding Flare is often a much better defensive reaction. Heavy armor, like I said, is very useful for druids as well. In reverse, I think that a cleric doesn't benefit as much from taking druid levels, but mixing and matching these classes with a 3-9 split or a 1-11 split can be extremely powerful. Druid spellcasters, wild shaping druids are pretty feat hungry because they need Tavern Brawler and they still usually need to hit 20 wisdom. Druid spellcasters don't really need 3 feats because they just need to hit 20 wisdom. You can certainly benefit from Resilient Constitution or Warcaster on them, but sometimes Warding Flare is just better at maintaining your concentration anyways, and that mix is better. Giving you Sanctuary to help maintain concentration on non-combat spells or on Moonbeam also means that you don't have to necessarily invest as heavily in con resilience. Of course, you can also still hit 20 wisdom if you use Ethel's Hair on that character combo, but even discounting that, it's just a very powerful combination to have a 20 wisdom character. You only really need 2 feats on that character. They also give you a ton of item independence if you mix these two characters together, because it gives you access to every suit of armor and every shield in the game, and that is very valuable for not conflicting for item resources with other characters. Altogether, these characters have just a ton of synergy, several broken combos that you can do with them, but also just at base, lots of synergy between the two wisdom casters, and I'm going to place them in S tier. Cleric and Fighter. So these two characters have the distinction of being two of the best dip classes in the game. You can splash a single level of Cleric or Fighter or a couple levels of each into just about any build and improve the character class by adding one level of each of these classes. The classes added to one another are no exception to that, and pair exceptionally well together in a variety of ways. A single level of Cleric for a fighter build can give you War Cleric bonus action attacks, which is something that Fighter often suffers from, is not having a great use for their bonus action. A Great Weapon Fighter, for example, has a use for their bonus action with the additional Great Weapon Master attack, but can only trigger that inconsistently. Adding in the a few times per day additional bonus action main hand attack is very useful. A Throwing Weapon Fighter has effectively no other way to use their bonus action effectively, and adding in War Cleric means that you can add an additional attack to this already extremely high burst damage build, going from 4 attacks in the opening round of combat to 5 in the mid-game, and from 6 attacks to 7 in the endgame. That's a relatively small increase to your overall DPS, because it's a small proportion of your overall damage, but it can often take you over the line from almost killing an enemy to definitely killing an enemy, even a very powerful boss enemy, because that's so many attacks with a thrown weapon, and is therefore just one of the most powerful things that you can possibly be doing. For more on that, check out my build guide, The Consistent Killer, which goes over an Eldritch Knight Thrower, using a War Cleric dip to maximize your damage. Outside of a War Cleric dip, though, there's a lot of other great things that you can get from adding Cleric into Fighter. Of course, as I've already mentioned, Cleric adds a ton of utility options to any character you add a single level of it to. But for Fighter, also, the one thing that Fighter also sometimes struggles to do is have great uses for their reaction. Most Fighter builds will only be using their reaction for opportunity attacks, or occasionally ripostes if you're a Battlemaster Fighter, but with Light Cleric, you can get one of the best defensive reactions in the game in addition, at the no resource cost, in addition to those possible uses. This can turn your fighter from being extremely tanky, because they're a fighter, to being basically impossible to kill, because they consistently give enemies disadvantage on attacks against them, combined with your very high native AC from just being a heavy armor user, and you can make your fighter basically invincible. Even if you want to add in a few more levels, there's definitely some cool stuff you can do with additional levels of Cleric combined with Fighter. As with many other tanky melee characters, just running around with Spirit Guardians up is pretty good. Is that like a build I'd recommend, the sort of 5-7 split? Maybe not necessarily, but I don't think it would be bad at all. And you can definitely do some interesting things with sort of more fightery focused builds with higher levels of War Cleric for more additional attacks or the additional chance to hit, or other various cleric builds that can add a lot of additional utility to your fighter character. In reverse, a single level of fighter applied at taken as your first level for a cleric build adds Constitution saving throws, adds heavy armor proficiency if you're going for a cleric that doesn't normally get heavy armor proficiency, such as a light cleric, and adds a fighting style, which is extremely useful. Fighting styles are very, very powerful because they give you an additional AC, or for a cleric who's certain to be using a shield, the protection fighting style can actually add a whole extra dimension to your character, giving you the ability to protect allies and be even more of a powerful support character than you already were. For a second level of fighter, you can get Action Surge, obviously one of the most powerful mechanics in the game, and so while that does mean that you won't hit 6th level spells if you take 2 levels of fighter, that can still be really valuable, and even with higher levels of fighter, you can add in you can get to 5 for extra attack, add some Battle Master maneuvers to your War or Nature Cleric, and make use of their natural melee abilities much more usefully, and that can be a totally reasonable way to make a hybrid melee caster build much more viable. In general, for this character pairing, you're either going with a single level of War Cleric added to Fighter or a single level of Fighter added to a Cleric, usually a Light Cleric to make sure that you get heavy armor proficiency. But there's definitely a lot of different ways you can build this combo, and of course, the peak of this class combo with the War Cleric and Eldritch Knight is one of the best character builds in the entire game, probably in the top 5 or so, and so I would be remiss not to place this combo in S tier, even just for that build, but outside of that build, there are tons of different things you can do with this character combination that make it extremely powerful. Cleric and Monk. Cleric and Monk is an interesting combination because while Cleric normally can be added, one level of Cleric can be added to just about any character and make it better, a lot of the things that you get from Cleric are things that Monk actually doesn't want. Weapon and armor proficiencies are basically completely useless to Monk, so you can't use armor, you can't use shields with most Monk builds. Not every Monk build, but most Monk builds, especially because in Baldur's Gate, Monk builds are so heavily incentivized to be unarmed attackers thanks to the extremely broken power of Tavern Brawler. You also don't benefit very much from the bonus action main hand attack that War Cleric gives you, which is something a lot of other martial characters are very interested in, because Monk already has free bonus action attacks, and in fact prefers to make offhand attacks with their bonus action because of Flurry of Blows. So you don't really benefit very strongly from the War Cleric buff. However, Light Cleric still offers a lot of utility to monks because monks, again, suffer from not having a defensive reaction in most monk builds, and Light Cleric can make your otherwise quite squishy and vulnerable monk. One of the major downsides of playing monk is that they are relatively squishy for a melee character with low hit points and low AC compared to other melee characters, and need to use their mobility, their impressive mobility, in order to stay safe in combat. Adding Warding Flare to a monk can be extremely powerful because it takes their relatively low AC all the way up to a very reasonable value when most attacks against them have disadvantage. Of course, they also do benefit from all the other utility spells of Cleric that are valuable on every character. In reverse, a 1-level monk dip for a Cleric can be quite powerful if you want for some reason to build an unarmored Cleric. Adding Monk's unarmored defense allows your Cleric, who's already maxing out their wisdom, to use their wisdom for their AC instead of using armor. Is that something that you're actually going to want to do? Usually not, because Clerics already get weapon and armor shield and armor proficiencies, so unarmored defense isn't usually going to be a huge point in favor of a monk dip for Cleric, but if that is your goal for a build, then that is definitely something that you can do. Monk's dexterity-based weapon attacks and offhand attacks are not terribly useful for Clerics, who mostly are not going to be using those mechanics anyways, but the unarmored defense is possible to support a niche build with that. As with other martial characters, a Cleric monk using Monk's extreme mobility and focusing on Spirit Guardians could be a viable build, but I think in general, if your goal is to zip around the battlefield with a third level Spirit Guardians up, you're better off doing that with a build that makes you tankier, like Fighter, or just with Rogue, which will give you additional mobility and a lot more usefulness for your Cleric, rather than trying to add Monk in, because Rogue has a lot of great defensive actions as well as even more mobility in some ways, thanks to the bonus action dashes. So mostly we're just looking at this as the one level light Cleric dip in a normal Monk build, and I think that that is actually a pretty good use case for a build, but somewhat hard to fit in. Monk builds tend to be very constrained in how you can build them in Baldur's Gate 3, because they are very feat hungry, since they need Tavern Brawler, and almost all monks are going to want 3 levels of Rogue and at least 6 levels of Monk, and when you're already at that point, you're very incentivized to continue at least a little further to make sure you're actually getting all the feats that you need. So most Monk builds are going to be locked in at 8-3 or 8-4 or 9-3 Monk and Rogue, and just don't have room for the Cleric dip. If you want to do an 8-4 or an 8-3-1 build with a level of Light Cleric, I think that could be a totally reasonable build, but it does prevent you from getting the 9th level power spike on Open Hand Monk. It's something that you could maybe do with a Shadow or 4 Elements Monk if you really want to add some extra defensive elements to those monks. Overall, though, I think that these two classes, although at first glance they seem like they should synergize fairly well, what they actually give to one another is just not something that most builds will want, and the things that you do actually want from pairing these two classes are very hard to fit into the traditional builds. And because Monk is such a constrained build typically, with very high requirements for specific feats and specific class levels, specific items, specific place in a party, you just don't have a lot of room to play with for adding in levels of other classes. So I'm going to say this is a niche build. It's something that you can definitely do, and you can gain a reasonable, you can certainly make a reasonable build out of it. There's a lot of opportunities you can do to make a sort of tankier Monk a little more resilient and a little more forgiving to play, and I think that would be a totally reasonable way to go, but it is relatively constrained. I don't know if it's better than the traditional Monk build, and so I think in general this is going to be a C-tier combination. Cleric and Paladin. So you're going to get tired of hearing me say this, but like all martial characters, a level of War or Light Cleric can add a bunch of utility and some additional damage or defensive utility to a Paladin build. However, there is a little more difficulty putting this into a Paladin build than into other builds. Again, much like Monk, Paladins are fairly constrained in how they level up, although because Cleric is a caster, you can take a few Cleric levels and gain access to higher level spell slots for your smite attacks. So you can mix in a few levels of Cleric to a Paladin build and reach higher level smites. You can add in some of the utility, some of the defensive or offensive utility that War or Light Cleric give you, and both of those are very good. The issues arise in a couple ways. One is that if you actually want to use the spells that Cleric gives you, like let's say you wanted to do a Spirit Guardians build with Paladin, you are extremely multi-attribute dependent. Paladins already need to have very high stats in strength and constitution and in charisma, and usually need very good stats in dexterity and wisdom as well to maximize your initiative and saving throws and so on. Adding in a hard requirement to have high wisdom makes Paladin's already high multi-attribute dependency even worse. And so if you actually wanted to use the spells from Cleric, then you're adding in even more stat requirements for your Paladin, so they're going to be even greedier for stat items like elixirs and the Constitution belt and whatever, or Constitution amulet and whatever. But those attribute requirements are something you can definitely still work around if you really want to add in levels of Cleric. The real downside is that if you're taking levels of Cleric to reach higher level spell slots, you're not taking levels of Warlock or Sorcerer or Bard charisma classes that pair more naturally with Paladin without introducing those multi-attribute dependency issues. You can also benefit on Paladin from Life Cleric because you have a bunch of natural healing abilities already, so Life Cleric can improve those. Although it doesn't work with every source of healing that Paladins have, it's still pretty useful for some of the ones that you have, and adding in Healing Word as well can be quite useful. So there's definitely some applications for levels of Cleric in a Paladin build. It's, I think, probably weaker than other typical Paladin multi-classes, but certainly still totally reasonable and something that you can do. For Paladin levels in a Cleric build, I think in general you are not going to gain that much, but adding in 2 levels of Paladin for smite attacks on a more melee-focused Cleric, like a War Cleric or a Nature Cleric, if that's something that you're interested in doing. You could have Nature Cleric using Shillelagh to give you wisdom-based attacks, add in Paladin smites, and suddenly you're doing tons and tons of damage. So that is a build that I think is totally reasonable and will give you a lot of power for your character while not costing you that much, and making a Cleric a absolutely viable melee attacker as a result. You do have some level constraints with some of these builds, because if you want 2 levels of Paladin for smites in your Cleric build, then you're missing out on 6th level spells, although not 6th level spell slots, because Paladin as a half caster means you'll still get the 6th level spell slot. And in vice versa, you want to usually hit at least 7th level of Paladin, and so then if you add in 5 levels of Cleric, that's your whole build, but that is a way that it fits together pretty well. I think that overall, this build offers a lot of different possibilities, can be built in a lot of different ways. I think in general, it is slightly weaker than some of the other combinations with these 2 classes, and so I'm going to rate it only A tier, but I think that there's definitely a lot of things that you can do with these 2 characters together. They offer a lot of intriguing possibilities, somewhat more constrained than some of the other multi-classes that we have available, but as I've already mentioned, like 5 different possible options for this build. I think you will definitely not go wrong mixing these 2 classes. The only reason that I'm placing it in A tier is that I think both of the classes have better multi-class options that mostly do the same things but better, or are slightly weaker versions of other potential builds, like adding in smiting attacks to Clerics is usually just not as good as adding them into to a Warlock or whatever who can use high-level spell slots more consistently. Either way, though, still a powerful build, and definitely A tier. Cleric and Ranger. Cleric and Ranger is a class combination that I think basically has just one way to build it, and that is adding in a level of War Cleric to an 11-level Ranger build, because the War Cleric bonus action attack can be used with, for example, Hunter Ranger's additional volley attacks, because those just count as attack actions, and the way that the interface works for War Cleric lets you use special attack actions in that way. Those obviously levels line up extremely well because Ranger wants to hit 11 levels in its class. It's one of the classes that benefits the most from getting to level 11 in its specific class, and Cleric is the best 1-level dip in the game, so of course those are a natural fit together, giving you the access to additional attacks. How strong is that build? The answer is very strong. Extra volleys every a few times a day will win you massive amounts of combats. Extra attacks with a Gloomstalker Ranger is also very good. It's a little less useful for Beastmaster Rangers, although it's also worth noting that there's some cool tricks you can do with Beastmaster Ranger. 1 level of Cleric just to cast Sanctuary on your animal companion is pretty useful, as well as the additional options you get from Healing Word. Rangers also will tend to be making a lot of skill checks, so adding in guidance to their arsenal is worth a lot. Overall, you're not benefiting that strongly from the proficiencies that Cleric gives you, because you already get most of the proficiencies, and you can get heavy armor from Ranger Knight at very little opportunity cost, if that is something that you are interested in picking up. And Rangers do tend to be somewhat feat heavy, because they will want to hit 20 dexterity and get sharpshooter, so they will usually want 3 feats. So it definitely is a real cost to take a level of Cleric. because you won't necessarily be getting the feat. But if you are using Ethel's hair or whatever, or just the gloves of dexterity, in order to not need to hit all of those feats, then you can definitely benefit from multiclassing with a level of cleric. The war cleric additional attacks are how you reach some of the highest archery damage totals in the game. So even just for that build, this is an A tier combination by itself. However, I think there are a couple other things you can do that add in just some like niche builds that are available to this class combo. If you wanted, for whatever reason, to do an archery-focused cleric, 3 levels of Gloomstalker Ranger is worth a lot. You get the additional attack, which will allow you to add in some extra attacks. If you are a war cleric, you could build an archery-focused cleric using Ranger, and I think that would actually be a pretty good build. You get archery fighting style and end up getting a lot of the benefits of Ranger quite early. Is that the strongest build or one I'd recommend for Honor Mode? Not really, but that's why I'm saying it's a niche option. And of course, like all other martial characters, and this is even more true for Ranger because you are a wisdom casting character, you can use Spirit Guardians alongside what you're doing in order to do regular damage if you're running around with a melee ranger. Making a hybrid ranger cleric is something that is a little bit difficult. Just the leveling requirements are quite tight, but definitely a possible build that you can do. So I think there are, outside of the natural use of war cleric giving you an extra bow shot, there are a few other uses for this build, but none of them are so powerful that it will move it out of A tier. But just the War Cleric adding in an additional volley to a Hunter Ranger is so good all by itself that it bumps this combination up into A tier, and there's some other things we can do with it as well. Cleric and Rogue. So once again, we're at 2 classes that are extremely valuable as a few levels of each of them added to another class, and once again, it's not that surprising that there's really interesting things that we can do with these 2 characters together. Now, I don't think they're as powerful together as Cleric and Fighter, because 1 level of Rogue just doesn't have quite the punch for a Cleric build as 1 level of Fighter, but a few levels of Rogue can offer some really interesting things to various Cleric builds. Check out for more on this class combination, my Shadowheart lore-friendly build, which I call Char's Shadow, where I go into extensive detail about combining these 2 characters, but I'll also talk about the strengths and what each of them brings to the other. Obviously, a single level of Cleric for a Rogue has a bunch of utility, as it always does. Sanctuary can be very useful for keeping your Rogue safe. Guidance is extremely helpful for a Rogue who's going to be doing almost all of your skill checks in various situations, and will give this character the ability to self-cast Guidance. Also, Thaumaturgy on a Rogue, if they're your party face, can also be extremely helpful. So, as always, those abilities are very powerful. Rogue also usually will not be concentrating on something, unless it's an Arcane Trickster, and even then, not always, and so adding in Bless to your Rogue gives a character who normally wouldn't be concentrating on a spell a really powerful concentration effect that they can spend their turns on. So the single level dip is always still really good for Rogue, and Rogue has very low level requirements. Most Rogue builds want to stop at level 3 or level 5 of Rogue, and so you don't necessarily need a lot of levels and can fit in 1 level dips for utility, things like Bless, and so on. You can also go a little further in Rogue and Cleric together to gain a second dash and bonus action hides, which allows you to apply Spirit Guardians really well. If you want to do a Spirit Guardians focused build, this is probably the best way. Again, refer to my build guide for more on that. But this allows you to double dash around the arena, playing Mario Kart, and apply your Spirit Guardians to every enemy in the fight. With multiple bonus actions from Thief, you can jump over people, move around them while not provoking opportunity attacks, engage and disengage at will, consistently applying the damage from your Spirit Guardians to a bunch of enemies. So there's a bunch of cool builds that we can do. You can also benefit just from 3 levels of Rogue, just for various uses of bonus actions with Cleric. The ability to dash and cast Spiritual Weapon is not, in the same turn, is not actually at all useless. That sounds like a small benefit, but there's a lot of combats where that's going to come up pretty frequently. So there are, while you do lose some power, obviously, because you're going to lose your highest level spell slots, there's a lot of things that you can add to these builds. A level of Light Cleric for a Rogue as well adds another defensive reaction in addition to Uncanny Dodge, or if you aren't getting enough Rogue levels to reach Uncanny Dodge, then you get a defensive reaction which can be very valuable. Heavy Armor proficiency, usually not so good for rogues, but shield proficiency can be great. There's a lot of rogue builds that really want shield proficiency, especially if they're using a two-handed bow, so they can benefit from shield proficiency for most of the game before you get two daggers that you really want to wield for additional crit chance. You can usually get that from your race rather than from a class level, but again, these are all minor benefits that add up to a pair of classes that, while at first glance it seems like they don't synergize very much, each of them at very low levels just add so much into a build that there's a million different builds you can make with these two classes together, and I'm again going to rate it A tier. I think that this is an easily underrated character combination, but so much of these classes is so front-loaded in both cases that you can spend very few levels on each of them and gain a huge benefit for the build that you're trying to do, and as such, they work together very well. Cleric and Sorcerer. I mean, so what's not to love about this combination? So first off, one level dips in either direction are extremely powerful. Sorcerer benefits really, really strongly from shield and heavy armor proficiency, and Cleric benefits really, really strongly from the shield spell, constitution save proficiency, and unlimited out-of-combat flight, both of which you get from a one-level dip from the other class. The utility spells that each of them can provide to the other are things you wouldn't necessarily have available, and they are incredibly powerful just as one-level dips into each other's classes. With 2 levels, you can also get Tempest Cleric, which allows you to maximize lightning spells on your Sorcerer. Maximized lightning on your Sorcerer means that your Sorcerer is able to do massive amounts of damage, combined with the wet condition and the maximized lightning that you can do, and is the core component of the one-shot Lightning Lord build that I posted. Definitely go check out that build guide for one of the most powerful possible builds in the game that is guaranteed to do massive damage to enemies, basically one-shotting every enemy in the entire game. That build by itself would be enough to make these two classes incredible, but of course it is not just that. There's also the default combinations of just one level of each of them for the other, both of which are just really good and will give you way more than the 12th level of either class would usually give you. You also get the option to do more involved level splits if you want. A 7-5 or usually a 9-3 or 7-5 build, one or the other, will end up with various combinations of spells that you can get from the other class that are pretty useful. In general, I think that you're going to want to err on the side of lower levels of Cleric and more of Sorcerer if you want to do this, but you can still just use the fact that this gives you 6-level spell slots by combining 2 full spellcasters to lean into the utility spells from one of the classes and the combat and control spells from the other class, and both of these classes get their very best spells at level 3, so you can totally make a hybrid character of the two and upcast a damage spell like a Lightning Bolt or a Spirit Guardians as your main damage source, while making use of the powerful combat and control spells that each of them give you at various levels. I think that's generally worse than going to 11 levels in either of those builds, but not worse by enough that it's going to hurt your character that much, so it's another niche application for these two builds, which already have an incredible amount of synergy. Honestly, there's not that much to talk about here. The Lightning build is one of the most powerful builds in the entire game, and each of these characters offers so much, each of these classes offers so much to the other as a one-level dip, that even without having access to a top 5 build, one of the most broken builds in the game, these would already be an S-tier combination, but of course that already adds it. That is even more so, and they get a bunch of additional, more niche options besides. S tier, of course. Cleric and Warlock. Now, obviously, I've been rating Cleric combined with every single caster class S tier so far, so you may be surprised to learn that I think Cleric and Warlock actually don't synergize that strongly. A lot of what the one-level Cleric dip gives you are things that Warlock isn't that interested in, or can get more powerfully from elsewhere, although I will say it's still just very good. I mean, Guidance and Thaumaturgy, still very good for a Cleric. Heavy Armor and Shield Proficiency, or the Light Cleric Defensive Reactions, still very good for a Warlock. But less powerfully so, and with some stronger caveats than from other characters. Paladin, for example, gives you a lot of the same things that you get from a Cleric dip while still being a Charisma character, and builds towards smite attacks with your Warlock. So you're more likely, if you want to build a heavy armor, martial weapon proficiency Warlock, to use a Paladin dip or a Fighter dip for con save proficiency rather than a Cleric dip. That said, the Cleric dip still isn't bad. It will certainly add a lot to your Warlock build. In reverse, Warlock really doesn't offer much to Cleric as a dip, because a lot of the stuff that you get from a couple levels of Cleric a couple levels of Warlock, still requires you to have decent Charisma scores. One reason to take a single level of Warlock is for Command from Fiend Warlock, is for Mortal Reminder from Goo Warlock, is for Eldritch Blast, all of which require you to have reasonable Charisma scores in order to make use of their abilities. So for a Charisma-based caster, a Warlock dip can be useful, but for a Cleric it's much less useful because it adds in a bunch of multi-attribute dependency requirements, which make your attribute requirements for Cleric much tighter. If you can sort those out, it's still a reasonable dip, but that's pretty difficult to do and requires pretty precise building and itemization, and it's going to put a lot of strain on your party's resources to support that character, or make this character need specific late-game items in order to function with the appropriate attributes. It's not impossible to do that, but definitely something that is difficult to do. For more levels of each of these classes mixed with one another, they still don't synergize that well, because Warlock caster levels don't count as caster levels. So when you are actually adding the two together, you will not be getting higher level spell slots. You will only get the spell slots of the level of each of the two classes to whatever level you would have taken them. You aren't gaining 6th level spells the way you would by evenly mixing Sorcerer and Cleric, for example. That means that you need the abilities that they provide to be significantly better. And while there are some cool things that you can do with them, obviously Darkness and Devil's Sight is a really powerful combo that can still work with your Cleric and be pretty good. And higher level Cleric spells can still be pretty useful for Warlock. In particular, the control spells that you get, like Plant Growth from Nature Cleric, can actually be quite valuable for holding things in Hunger of Hadar without having a concentration spell. But those are pretty niche uses that require a lot of levels invested and are easier to do from a party member or something like that, or just by using Evard's Tentacles or a lower level spell from your Warlock. The pairing of these two classes requires, therefore, some careful navigation, and I think mostly is not a huge boost, although the fact that the 1-level Cleric dip is still just totally reasonable for a Warlock means that I'm going to rate this B tier. I don't think it deserves any lower than that, because 1-level Cleric dip is just always just that good, but outside of that use case, these classes don't have a ton of synergy in general. Cleric and Wizard. So, much like with Wizard and Bard, some of the power of this class combination comes down to the odd rules interpretation that Larian has gone with, where wizards can learn spells from scrolls of up to their caster level rather than their wizard level, meaning that 1 level of wizard and 11 levels of cleric effectively get you access to all of the spell pools of both classes. That's incredibly powerful, and I think in fact is, in general, the optimal way to build a wizard, as I went over in my build guide, The Real Best Wizard in Baldur's Gate 3. The secret 9th wizard school is 11 levels of cleric and 1 level of wizard, getting access to both characters' spell pools. You'll focus on wizard for most of your offensive abilities, I think is generally better, because wizards get some of the best ones in the game, and cleric for your defensive abilities and saving throws, although you can of course reverse those. Cleric for your defensive and utility spells, that don't require attack rolls or saving throws, and that way you can max out your intelligence. Although you can certainly reverse that and do 11 levels of cleric and add in a level of wizard for some utility spells from the wizard spell list. Shield, for example, is extremely good and just one that you can add in. There's a bunch of different ways that you can manage to build that, and it will be extremely powerful either way. In reverse, 1 level of Cleric for 11 levels of Wizard is also really good, because Cleric just gives so much to other caster classes by giving them access to heavy armor proficiency and shield proficiency, which is extremely valuable for a wizard, making them much, much more resilient. You can also do more detailed splits, just like with Sorcerer and Cleric. Wizard and Cleric have a lot of possible level splits to get the powerful subclass features of both of them. Obviously, Tempest Cleric is one of the ones that works really well with Wizard, and in fact, the optimal way to build that character is to use Wizard, Sorcerer, and Cleric to get access to meta magic and the Tempest Cleric class feature while getting con save proficiency and the right caster stat for items and 6th level spells, because the wizard can provide all of those things, so you can definitely add in additional power by combining all 3 classes together, and I go over that again in way more detail in my build, the One-Shot Lightning Lord, so check out that video if you're interested in that character for one of the most powerful characters in the game. The wizard also adds in divination wizard levels, can be extremely powerful for a cleric. If you don't necessarily feel like you need 6th level spells, you can add in a couple levels of divination. A couple levels of cleric mixed with an abjuration wizard can make your abjuration wizard even tankier, or even make for an interesting hybrid tank. If you want to focus on spirit guardians or whatever, you can have a bunch of levels of abjuration wizard and run around with spirit guardians up alongside abjuration wizard defensive class levels, which are extremely powerful as well, or defensive damage block, which is extremely powerful as well, helping you maintain concentration on one of the most powerful damaging spells in the game. There's tons of different options for how you want to construct these level splits. You can also take levels of cleric on a necromancer wizard for aid to increase the power of your undead minions, which is, of course, incredibly powerful as well, and very important to a lot of those builds. Overall, I'd say there's, 30, 40 different builds that work with these two characters together, and many of those builds are top tier or in the top possible characters in the game, even aside from just the very basic default usage of one level of each of them is great for the other, because neither of them needs more than 2 feats for the most part, and so can benefit extremely powerfully from a level in another class that that patches a bunch of the weaknesses of the class. Obviously, the most powerful use case for the one, like the 11 levels of cleric and 1 level of wizard gets you so much that it's ridiculous, but the other way around is just also a great character. So even without the one broken build or the somewhat dodgy rules interpretation of the wizard level stacking, this would still be an S tier character, and it has all of those and more besides, obviously an S tier combination, and that's great. I'm going to leave this up on screen because I know that people like to take screenshots or whatever of each of these as we go. As you can see, Cleric has a ton of powerful combinations, almost nothing that's actually bad to combine with Cleric, and even Monk, which I think is the least synergistic, still gives you some cool niche builds like the unarmored Clerics or offhand attacking Clerics if you want to go for a War Cleric. Not necessarily the most powerful, but still very possible. Cleric just gives you so much from 1 or 2 levels of Cleric that it is very rare that a build with a spare level shouldn't consider taking a level of Cleric. In fact, I think that I would go so far as to say any build that doesn't have a specific use for its last level should just take a level of Cleric at some point, because you will make that build better. Obviously, you have to be a little careful with your item and save DCs and whatever, but outside of that, you are getting so much from a single level of Cleric that it's just almost always worth taking unless you have a specific use for your other levels in mind. Many parties are going to be like 4 characters with a single level of Cleric because it's just so powerful a splash, and you can add it into just about any build and profit. Next up, Druid multiclasses. So Druid is a character that has some interesting struggles when it comes to multiclassing, because there's a lot that it can really benefit from taking a couple levels of another class, but it's a character that really wants to have a lot of levels in Druid in order to function. You really want to hit level 7 in order to get Conjure Woodland Being, one of the most powerful spells in the game. You really want to hit level 9 in order to get Conjure Elemental, another one of the most powerful spells in the game, but even better if you hit level 11, because then you can use the Myrmidon form, as well as the really powerful Druid 6th level spells of Hero's Feast and Wall of Thorns. There's a lot of incentive to continue taking levels in Druid all the way. You're also quite feat hungry, because if you're going to be a wild shaping Druid in Baldur's Gate, you basically have to take Tavern Brawler. It's just too powerful not to, and that adds a feat tax to a character that's already fairly feat starved, because it wants to hit level, it wants to hit 20 Wisdom, as well as gaining enormous benefits from Alert, just like every other character, but especially so for a control-focused spellcaster like the Druid. So there's definitely some challenges when you're trying to take levels of other characters when you're mixing them with Druid. Most of the time, 1 or 2 levels of Druid for another build will not give you that much, because Druid just doesn't offer as much as Cleric if you're going to multi-class with a wisdom-based spellcaster. But there's a couple builds that can benefit from a level or 2 of Druid, and of course, Spore Druid giving you the additional damage on every attack can be useful in builds that are making lots and lots of attacks. Whether that's worth it for 2 levels is going to be heavily dependent on the build. It needs to make a lot of attacks before 1d6 on every attack is worth spending 2 levels in a class that otherwise probably doesn't give you that much, but there are some builds where that's definitely very useful. Druid also still does gain all the benefits of multiclassing that every caster gains. Con save proficiency is extremely useful for Druids. Heavy armor proficiency is extremely useful for Druids, especially ones that are trying to stay in humanoid form, and especially for Spore Druids, because gaining the ability to have damage reduction from some of the particular suits of heavy armor, or from the heavy armor master feat, can help maintain access to your temporary hit points and stop them from draining, which is, of course, very powerful. The ability to then replenish your temporary hit points using the bugs with the Vital Conduit boots or whatever is something I go over extensively in my various Spore Druid guides, but it adds a whole extra layer of utility to any form of damage reduction that you can get from other classes. So I've already covered how having damage reduction from Barbarian Rage can be really useful to wild shape forms. Any other way to get heavy armor proficiency or anything like that can be very useful to Druids as well. Overall, a really interesting class to multiclass that has some challenges but also can gain a lot of power. First up, let's talk about Druid and Monk. So this is a classic tabletop combination, one of the most powerful and most common ways to build a Druid in tabletop D&D that does get a little bit worse in its transition to Baldur's Gate 3 for various reasons. In tabletop, of course, and in Baldur's Gate 3, the reason to take a level of Monk for your Druid is that you get unarmored defense from Monk, which allows you to use your Wisdom to generate your AC, to calculate your AC, and Druids, of course, will have maxed out Wisdom because they're a Wisdom-based spellcaster. This works in Wild Shape, which can be a huge boost to your Wild Shape form's AC. But there's a few reasons why this isn't quite as powerful as it sounds in Baldur's Gate, and definitely less powerful than it is in Tabletop. One is just how unarmored defense and Wild Shape AC is calculated, and to the available Wild Shape forms in Baldur's Gate 3. The unarmored defense AC that you get counts as the base AC, so 10 plus your Wisdom will count as the base AC for that Wild Shape form, and it will use the higher of that or the Wild Shape form's natural armor class, whatever their base AC is. The Wild Shape form will usually have a base AC somewhere in the 10 to 15 range, and a lot of the good Wild Shape forms already have 15 natural armor class, and so are not a 14 or 15 natural armor class, and so we're getting 1 to 2 bonus points of AC from the Monk's unarmored defense. Contrast this to what's available in Tabletop, where sometimes you're getting plus 6 AC in your Wild Shape form, and you can see why it's a little bit worse in Baldur's Gate 3. The second is that even for the Wild Shape forms that have low AC, they have low natural AC, they tend to also have low dexterity, meaning that your AC, even with the unarmored defense, just won't be high enough to stop you from getting hit. Going from 10 AC to 15 AC is obviously really good for a Wild Shape form, but 15 AC is still pretty low, so you're still going to get hit pretty constantly despite the massive boost, even though with a 50% increase in your armor class. So together, those two things definitely decrease it. Another reason that it's just not as powerful as for one level dip is that in Baldur's Gate 3, again, sort of unlike in Tabletop, Druid is incredibly feat hungry because Tavern Brawler is so mandatory for Wild Shape forms in Baldur's Gate 3. Even with the honor mode bug, where it doesn't do additional damage, plus 5 to hit on your Wild Shape attacks is incredibly powerful and basically makes it a mandatory pick on every Wild Shape focused Druid. All the Wild Shape form damage has sort of been calculated with the broken Tavern Brawler interaction in place as well, and so it just makes it so much worse to take wild shape forms without Tavern Brawler that I think it's basically a mandatory feat tax. That means that a 1-level dip costs you a lot more in Baldur's Gate 3 in terms of opportunity cost than it would in Tabletop, where Tavern Brawler isn't broken in the same way. So all of those things make it a little harder to get the 1-level monk dip to be as powerful as it is in Tabletop. That said, it's still a nice boost. You can definitely benefit from the unarmored defense AC in your wild shape forms. It is absolutely worth taking, and if you can make the stat requirements work and still fit in Tavern Brawler, incidentally, just at the time of recording, Tavern Brawler is bugged in honor mode so that it doesn't give you bonus damage from your strength, but does give you bonus attack. They fixed that in patch 6, the most recent large patch, so that it did give you damage, and then broke it again in patch 21. We don't actually know which way is intended. I assume it's supposed to work the way it does for every other character and give you double to both attack and damage, but just wanted to put that out there that at time of recording, it's currently bugged and doesn't give you either, and we don't actually know that that's a bug and not the intention, but I think it's reasonably certain that it is. All that put together means that you can still benefit pretty heavily from the 1-level monk dip, but it is at a much greater opportunity cost if you're used to taking this in Tabletop. Higher additional levels of monk for your druid build, for your sort of primarily druid build, don't give you an awful lot because as you take more than 2 levels off of druid, you lose your 3rd attack in wild shape forms and so on. Monk doesn't give a lot to a Spore Druid build in general, although the offhand unarmed attack can be pretty useful. But the unarmored defense is much less useful for a Spore Druid because in humanoid form you're just going to be wearing armor, and of course Spore Druids have a particular suit of armor that they really want to be wearing. And so overall it is not going to be as powerful as you might think. In the other direction, there's basically no reason to take a non-Spore Druid dip in a Monk build, because Druid just doesn't add anything that Monk is particularly interested in. Guidance is reasonable, but you can probably just get that from a Cleric instead, and there's just not that much else that a Druid would be interested in, that a Monk would be interested in from a Druid. If you were going for a non-Tavern Brawler Monk with a staff of some kind, you could potentially use Shillelagh on a Monk, to have a wisdom-based monk attacking with a wisdom-based staff attack, and that would be pretty cool. That is potential niche usage for a druid dip. And of course, with a 2-level dip into Spore Druid, you get the additional damage on every one of your attacks, which with Monk Flurry of Blows is going to be a lot of attacks, provided that you can maintain the temporary hit points. This has the same downsides that other monk dips, other monk builds that require more than require classes in non-rogue classes have, which is just that monk builds are very constrained and usually are going to be locked in at 9-3 with rogue or 8-4 with rogue, so adding in 2 druid levels is pretty difficult. And monks are pretty squishy, have relatively low AC. It's pretty hard not to lose those temporary hit points, so while it adds a lot of damage, it's definitely difficult. I think overall this build combination is still just very good, but I'm a little surprised to have said like some negative things about it just because it is so powerful in Tabletop. But in Baldur's Gate 3, the context is different enough that I'm going to rate it A tier, whereas in a Tabletop combination of these two classes would certainly be an S tier class combination. Druid and Fighter. So this is yet another combination of Fighter with a caster class, where taking an initial level of Fighter can be extremely powerful because it gives you con save proficiency and heavy armor proficiency, as well as a fighting style and some additional self-healing, all of which are very powerful. Defense fighting style for a caster is extremely powerful. Heavy armor proficiency for druids is really good. So all of those things work together to just make a 1-level initial fighter dip very good. Druids also can get away with 1 level of fighter because one of the things that makes druids feat hungry is wanting warcaster or resilient con. Fighter means that you don't need either of those because you have con save proficiency instead of having to get it with a feat. Although if you can reach 20 wisdom some other way, you can get both and be really, really good at maintaining concentration, so it adds in even more possibilities. With 2 levels of fighter, you get Action Surge, which lets you enter Wild Shape and then act in the same turn, even as a non-Moon Druid, or enter Wild Shape and then do 2 actions, both of which are incredibly powerful, and those 2 actions can use all 3 of your Druid weapon attacks, or Druid attacks, because it's Action Surge, not Haste or Bloodlust, so you get your full additional extra attacks if you Action Surge, then bonus action Wild Shape and attack twice with your full set of attacks. That can be a huge amount of burst damage with 2 levels of fighter. In reverse, there's lots of fighter builds that make many attacks per round. Action Surge can let you do that, so various archer fighter builds can benefit pretty heavily from Spore Druid. Fighters, heavy armor proficiencies, and so on can give you access to a lot of damage reduction, so the Spore Druid temporary hit points can be quite valuable. So there's definitely lots of other splits that you can do as well. I think the most common way to pair these classes is going to be Druid with 1 or 2 levels of fighter for the very powerful abilities that fighter gives you, but there's definitely alternate ways that you can build it. More even splits are very possible. Check out my Jaheira lore-friendly build for one example of a 6-6 split between these 2 characters, which I think is totally viable on Honor Mode and pretty powerful as well, because there are various synergies that each of these characters apply to the other that are extremely powerful. Druid also gives you a lot of cool stuff, cool utility for your fighter build. Even just having Longstrider natively on a non-Eldritch Knight fighter is very powerful. Obviously, you can get Longstrider from anywhere in your party, but it's still pretty useful. And just various forms of Entangle and so on can be extremely powerful for various fighter builds, as long as you have the save DCs to make use of them. Together, these 2 classes just give you a lot. They are very cleanly able to be put together. The 1 or 2 level fighter dip for Druid is a classic, and many Druids will want to be built that way, especially if you're going for a more melee-focused Druid, then that is probably the optimal way to build it. At time of recording, I believe, I haven't tested this recently, so let me know, I believe there's also a bug where defense fighting style applies in Wild Shape. If you are wearing armor before you Wild Shape, so you don't even lose AC compared to the Monk version of the build for a lot of Wild Shape forms. But overall, these 2 character classes just pair extremely well together. Druid wants to hit level 11 and also get con save proficiency. Fighter, 1 level of fighter, meshes in perfectly to that. S-tier combination, just a great combination of classes. Druid and Paladin. So at first glance, this looks like a character combo that would pair quite well together. 2 levels of Paladin added into any full spellcasting class lets you spend your high-level spell slots on smites for massive melee burst damage. However, Wild Shape-focused Druids already have massive melee burst damage, and probably get more out of action surging with fighter than they do out of making a smite attack, aside from the fact that you can't make smites while in Wild Shape, so the Wild Shape-focused Druids don't really want levels of Paladin for smite attacks. That means that that version of the character is restricted to Spore Druids, who can benefit pretty strongly from adding in some extra burst damage. Your typical play pattern on a Spore Druid, mostly in the late game, mostly doesn't involve making melee attacks. You're going to just be using your very powerful spellcasting and control spells to use your Druid abilities, and using your bonus temporary hit points just to give yourself additional resiliency more than the additional damage you get from Spore Druid. But the fact that Paladin allows you to then cast Shillelagh and make a big smite attack using your wisdom is pretty nice. That's definitely something that you can do in a late game Spore Druid combo. That I think is a fairly powerful character, but the other options for splashing in 1 or 2 levels of Paladin into a Druid build are, generally speaking, pretty weak. The other way round, there just isn't much reason to. A couple levels of Druid don't really add anything to Paladin. 1d6 of Spore Druid damage is just a sort of a rounding error when you're talking about Paladin smites, because Paladins are all about making 1 big attack, not a bunch of little attacks. So you don't benefit much from Spore Druid, and you don't benefit much from the other kinds of Druid because you just aren't using Druid's utility spells or anything particularly on Paladin. So really, when you're looking at these 2 classes mixing, you are looking at just 2 levels of Paladin for smites on a Spore Druid. I think that that's a pretty powerful build, and definitely a way that you can build Spore Druid, so I think I'm going to rate this a B tier class combination, because there's only one real way to build it, and I don't know if it's actually even that much better than Spore Druid with Cleric levels or Spore Druid with Fighter levels, but it's definitely a reasonable and powerful way to build the character, and one that I think is totally worth exploring. One way that doesn't work, even though it probably should, is Oathbreaker Paladin combined with Spore Druid to increase your undead summons damage, because the Oathbreaker Paladin aura that you get at it doesn't show up until level 7, so you can't combine it except with 6th level Spore Druid for the bonuses that Spore Druids get at 6th level. So those characters, while they work moderately well together as party members, don't work well together as a multiclass at all, and of course it restricts you from getting to the later abilities of those characters. And the Oathbreaker aura doesn't work with most undead minions present in the game because it only works on undead weapon attacks, and the summons that you get from Animate Dead, undead melee weapon attacks, and the summons that you get from Animate Dead are either ranged or don't have weapons at all. So the Oathbreaker aura doesn't actually work on most undead available in the game. Altogether, that combo doesn't work as well, so you're just looking for smite attacks with a Spore Druid. That's a pretty powerful strategy, but it is the only strategy available to this class combination most of the time, so I think it's a B tier combo. Druid and Ranger. This again seems like a natural combination. You know, they're both nature-themed characters, so they work very well together thematically in one character. But honestly, there's not a lot of natural synergy between these two characters, except in certain narrow builds. The reason is just that both Ranger and Druid want a lot of levels to get the most out of the classes, and so the way that you can actually build them together just doesn't really add up. In order to benefit most heavily from each of these classes' abilities, you need 7 or 10 or 7 or 9 or 11 levels in them in order to gain the benefits of the character, and so you just aren't getting the good things from from at least one of these classes if you try to build levels of both of them. That means because they're both backloaded, they just don't synergize that well, even though thematically it seems like they should fit together very well. There is one exception to this, and that is the Spore Druid additional damage combined with Gloomstalker Ranger, who makes a lot of extra attacks, and can give you a ton of additional attacks with additional damage made at range, which is of course very powerful, and so very similar to the Sword Bard Spore Druid build, this just adds a d6 of damage to a lot of attacks that you're making in a round. Gloomstalker gets really good stuff at level 3, so unlike the other Ranger variants, is much more front-loaded and able to only take 3 levels, so you can combine 3 levels of Gloomstalker with 2 levels of Druid, with a couple levels of another martial class, like Fighter or Swordsbard, to generate a ton of attacks in a round, and that ton of attacks in a round can then have additional damage from your Gloomstalker levels, Archery Fighting Style from your Ranger levels, and additional damage from your Spore Druid levels. That usage, I think, brings this class combination up to B tier. Again, this is a single build, and is it even necessarily the optimal way to build those archer builds? It's pretty close and is totally a contender for one of the stronger archer builds in Dungeons & Dragons. Definitely check out my recent build guide called The Endless Archer that makes use of that combo. But it's the only way really to combine these two characters, and I think it is a narrow enough use case that they don't go higher than B tier. I don't think that this is a niche-only build because it is a very powerful build when you actually build it, but overall there aren't a lot of other ways to combine these characters in a way that makes sense, just because they both get their good abilities somewhat later in the build. Druid and Rogue. So, similar to Druid and Ranger, this character combination mostly exists because of various archer builds that make use of bonus offhand attacks with Thief Rogue and the additional damage from Spore Druid, or guaranteed critical hits from Assassin Rogue and the additional damage from Spore Druid. Combining that with Gloomstalker Ranger or with Swordsbard can give you a lot of additional damage, and the Spore Druid build, Spore Druid extra damage, which in Baldur's Gate 3, as opposed to tabletop, works at range, is very powerful to add to those builds. Other than those archer builds, I don't think there's a lot of great reasons to combine these classes. There's some cool niche builds you can do with them, like Thief Rogue can combined with Moon Druid, allow you to both bonus action Wild Shape and do the Owlbear bonus action Jump in the same round, which can give you some pretty cool mobility options, and you can do a lot of cool stuff just with various any caster can benefit reasonably well from the bonus action hide, disengage, and dash, although it costs you caster levels, but those are definitely viable options for casters. 9 levels of a caster and 3 levels of rogue can make a pretty evasive and powerful character that still gets most of the strength of a full caster while also being a lot safer. But overall, I would say those are mostly niche builds, and the reason that you're considering combining these two classes is just to add Spore Druid damage to your archer. That's still pretty good though, because the offhand damage that you get from extra bonus actions with Thief Rogue lets you make tons and tons of attacks with those various archer builds, and any build that can make lots of attacks benefits pretty strongly from Spore Druid. Also, the additional temporary hit points that Spore Druid gives you works pretty well with a lot of those archer builds that don't take a lot of hits, but can sometimes go down in a single shot, and so the additional temporary hit points can actually put you over the threshold to survive. If you accidentally put your character in a bad place, you can maybe survive a round of attacks that you wouldn't otherwise. I think that basically the rogue builds and the rogue druid builds and the ranger druid builds are almost always like the same build or the same build concept, and so I'm going to rate both of those B tier because it's basically just applying Spore Druid damage with lots of archery attacks. Druid and Sorcerer. So this is yet another character combination where Sorcerer gives another caster class con save proficiency, the shield spell, as well as a bunch of other good utility spells and dialogue skills, and infinite out of combat flight. All of those are incredibly powerful, and they're just as good for Druid as everyone else. Well, almost just as good for Druid as everyone else. The one downside of this combination for Druid is that you can't use Shield while in Wild Shape, so you get less usage out of the defensive reaction, unless you're a Spore Druid, of course, who benefits just as much as any other caster would. But even still, the ability to add in great defensive reactions, great utility, and con save proficiency, all for a single level, it just is worth so much to any caster class that a level of Sorcerer is just almost always great for a caster. This, again, just like the fighter dip, doesn't really cost that much for a druid to take, because while druids are very feat hungry, you don't lose out on that much because you get con save proficiency, which is probably what you were spending one of the feat slots on anyways. So you get a lot from a sorcerer level, and if you want to make your druid a dialogue character, if you're playing a main character druid, starting with a level of sorcerer is one of the best ways to get access to a bunch of dialogue skills, utility cantrips like friends, and minor illusion, as well as just a bunch of extra defensive options. This is an incredibly powerful one-level dip for any caster. In reverse, there's not a lot of reason for Sorcerer to consider a Druid dip. The Druid class just doesn't give you that much that, say, a level of Cleric wouldn't give you, and more besides. So I think that this is a more one-sided relationship than Sorcerer and some of the other caster classes out there, but still a very good option for Druid to take a level of Sorcerer. You can also consider a more even split. There's some cool things you can do with that. For example, quickened plant growth combined with other AoE damage spells is pretty powerful. Plant growth is not concentration, so you can put that down combined with something else and really trap enemies inside a spell. Although I will say that the addition of the bonus action Grasping Vine to Druid's arsenal has made that a slightly less attractive option. It's also something that's just very late game in general, and by the time you get it, you could have just cast a Wall of Thorns, which does all of those entangle and damage effects all in one spell. Obviously, that takes your 6th level spell slot, but it's usually going to be worth as much as Quicken Plant Growth plus another damaging effect like a Cloud Kill or whatever. That said, there's even just the addition of Sorcerer to your Druid arsenal, a Sorcerer level to your Druid to give you con save proficiency, something that Druids really, really badly want, as well as the additional utility is awesome. I think it would be sort of silly to not rate any Sorcerer any combination of sorcerer and another caster, excuse me, S tier, just because that's such a powerful and flexible combination. There's lots of ways that you can build them with a more even class bit split as well, although I think that in general, the way that you're going to build this character is just one initial sorcerer level to give all of that power and utility to your druid. Druid and Warlock. So this is a class combination that I did a build guide on called the Mighty Fart Druid, where you use the Warlock's Devil Sight and Darkness, combined with Land Druid's access to Darkness and immunity to difficult terrain and poison at later levels, to always be fighting inside hazardous terrain, clouds of darkness, clouds of poison on difficult terrain. That's a pretty powerful strategy that actually works very well throughout the entire game, but it is a very niche build, and I think it is the only way to construct these two characters together that makes sense. As with other caster classes, Warlock doesn't pair super well with Druid because you are actually restricting the level of spells that you can reach. And there just isn't a lot of synergy between these two classes when offered as like one level dips or anything along those lines. One level of Warlock for a Druid can be moderately useful just for some utility cantrips, but a lot of those are ones that Druid already has access to, and vice versa. You can get guidance on your Warlock, which isn't bad, but again, there's no reason to do that when you could take a level of Cleric, which just gives you way more for your Warlock. So I just don't think that these classes benefit that much from one level dips for the other class, or for 1 or 2 level dips for the other class. Even a Blade Pact Warlock doesn't really want Spore Druid damage, because while you're making a lot of weapon attacks, you have much better options in terms of increasing your damage, like Paladin Smites, for example. So I just don't think there's a sensible way to combine these two characters. There's other than the Darkness Cloud build, and it's worth mentioning that that build is replicatable through items. If you gain immunity to blind, you don't actually need the Warlock levels. It's just easier to do with the Warlock levels. So overall, this character combination enables one niche build that I can think of, and I just don't think that outside of that build there is much reason to combine these two characters. Let me know if you think there's a Warlock Druid build that I'm missing here, but for the most part, these two classes just really pull in opposite directions, using different casting systems, using different casting stats, and not really offering anything that the other doesn't already get or that it actually wants. Druid and Wizard. So I want to talk about sort of like other options for this build, but honestly, this is just, you can take a level of Wizard and gain a ton of utility spells for your Druid, because then you can learn all the Wizard spells from scrolls. There's a couple other neat combos you can do. Spore Druid and Necromancer together can be a powerful summoner character. If you want to go for like a 6-6 split between the two, you get access to all the summons. Abjuration Wizard can help protect wild shape forms, because the Arcane Ward stays in wild shape, or can help protect Spore Druid temporary hit points, although trying to get enough levels of both classes to have good wild shape forms and a good Arcane Ward, or a reasonable amount of temporary hit points and a good Arcane Ward, is pretty difficult. 2 levels of Wizard can give you Divination Wizard, which is very powerful for any caster, obviously guaranteeing failed saves on your control spells, of which Druids have a lot, is very good. So there's some other options for how you can build this character, but for the vast majority of cases when you're combining these two characters, you're doing it because you're taking a level of Wizard to gain all the powerful utility spells that Wizard gives you, in addition to being a full Druid spellcaster. That's extremely synergistic, because Druid wants to get to like level 11 to gain access to its 6th level spells. It does mean that you are giving up, I'd say that compared to, say, a Cleric taking a level of Wizard, the Druid is giving up a little more, just because Druids want feats more than most other spellcasters. I talked a couple times about how feat hungry Druids are. Again, just everyone be cool in the comments about that phrase. But overall, I think that this is still just an incredibly powerful class combination, just like Wizard and every other full caster. You're just getting to play 2 characters at once, and that's obviously a silly amount of power for any character to have. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I'm going to leave up this tier on the screen so that you can so that you can take a screenshot, excuse me, of the Druid multi-class options. I think that the lesson here with Druid is just that they pair very well with classes that are really good one-level dips. And so you can see that all the classes that have a lot of power packed into the first level or two pair very well with Druids. Because Druids don't have a lot of power at the Druids are a fairly backloaded class. They continue to get excellent spells and excellent class features as they level up. You typically want to pair them with classes that only require 1 or 2 levels in order to maximize the power of that character. And so that's why you see these classes that are just phenomenal 1-level dip classes doing extremely well with Druid. So this is going to be the end of this video because this has reached well over the 1-hour mark again, but I think we'll be able to get through this in 4 parts because each subsequent part is going to be shorter. Even though we only did 2 more classes this time, I think I will be able to do 3 in the next video and 5 in the final video to get through every single character combination in Baldur's Gate, every single multi-class combination in Baldur's Gate in only 4 videos, though I'm happy to go longer if it takes longer. Alright, my friends, hope you've enjoyed the video, and of course, as always, if you have, please feel free to leave a comment, like the video. Both of those things help me out a ton with the algorithm and showing people who might not have otherwise seen these videos, which I appreciate very much whenever you take the time to do so. And of course, you can feel free to subscribe to my channel for the future parts of this series and other strategy game content. And if you've really enjoyed this, then, feel free. I do, of course, really appreciate it when people choose to show their support financially through the buttons below the video. Though, of course, do not feel obligated. Just taking the time to watch the video is something that I deeply appreciate and is more than enough for me. Cheers, my friends. Catch you next time.